Okay. Welcome everyone to Fundamentals of Kabbalah and Chassidut. We are continuing our series, The Life and Teachings of the Baal Shem Tov. Tonight we're starting something new. I'm very excited about it. I believe I've shown you this book before. This is called the Keter Shem Tov. The Keter Shem Tov is perhaps the most extensive and authoritative compilation of the teachings of the Baal Shem Tov. We spent a considerable amount of time in another type of compilation that was called Amud Tefillah, if you remember, in Parshat Noach. And we were on that for, I don't know how many weeks, 6, 7, 8 weeks. A recording of everything the Baal Shem Tov, not everything, but many of the things that the Baal Shem Tov said about prayer. The Keter Shem Tov, again, the Baal Shem Tov did not write any of his teachings. These are all recorded by his different students and students of his students until it was compiled many years after the Baal Shem Tov into this book called the Keter Shem Tov. What we're going to see here, it's as you can see, it's a huge book. It's huge. If we went through the whole thing, it would take us years. I'm beginning pretty much from the start, and I've chosen the ones that I feel that I can give over that are important to how we are learning about the Baal Shem Tov. But two things that we see here and that are important to remember is in Amud Tefillah, it was more what the students had learned from the Baal Shem Tov. Here are direct quotes of his Torah, not what he said about prayer, but here it's more. Most of these are fairly concise. Some are longer, some are more simple, some are more complicated. But here, these are the teachings of the Baal Shem Tov. But in the teachings come the whole framework of what would turn into the Hasidic movement. And that's what I'm going to try to give over, is to try to show how each of these seemingly individual Torahs about specific verses usually, or stories in the Talmud, or verses from the Torah, give over what would become the pillars of the philosophy of the Baal Shem Tov's Chassidut. So the first thing that we see here is that the Torahs of the Baal Shem Tov are highly innovative, highly creative, inspired, where the way he would look at a verse or a story, this absolutely paved the way for all further Torah coming out of Chassidut. And it really was very, very similar to how the sages at the time of the Gemara, when they would look at a verse or a story, like what they saw in it was highly, like I said, innovative and creative. But it's all usually in the words themselves, in the text itself. In other words, the Baal Shem would read the verse and see in it things that really people had not seen up to then. He was really what's called a mechadesh, a innovative revealer of Torah. The other thing that we're going to see throughout almost all of these Torahs is how much the Kabbalah is integrated into the teachings of the Baal Shem Tov. I've mentioned it before that the Baal Shem Tov, this is a general statement, was able to take the teachings of the Arizal, which were highly complex, and reformulate them into a language that could be understood psychologically, emotionally, spiritually, and very, very relevant to each person. That was not the purpose of the Arizal. The Arizal revealed, we'll call it Torah from heaven. And it was either you understood it or you didn't. It wasn't formulated in a way that it was, I think I used this expression before, Kabbalah 101. The Arizal only took students who were on an incredibly high level and had a total foundation in Kabbalistic thought. And then he gave over his Torah. Here, the Baal Shem Tov's purpose is completely different, is to take these teachings and reformulate them in a way that people could use them, could integrate them, could understand them. So those are the two themes that I want to point out, that it's very important that we keep in mind, as we know that the whole Hasidic movement is based on Kabbalistic teachings. But here we see it was from the Baal Shem Tov who was able to make that transition from Kabbalistic language or jargon and make it in a language that was easier to understand. And that's why many times the word psychologically is used to understand the teachings of Hasidut. So we're going to start, and like I said, some are short, some are longer, and I'll do my best to try to explain what's underneath. So the first one is like one of the shortest ones, but it's so I'll use the word clever, the way he explains this. So he says like this. Yeah, this is a story from the Gemara about a very, very colorful individual called Hanina ben Dosa. Hanina ben Dosa, there are many, many stories told about him in the Talmud. He was poverty-stricken virtually his whole life, and many stories that he and his wife barely had what to eat, and their house had barely any furniture. And yet he was considered one of the greatest sages. And he was also, like I said, very colorful. So the Gemara says, Yatsa bat kol v'yamar, kol ha'olam nizun bishvil Hanina beni. So the Gemara says that Hanina ben Dosa was so poor that many weeks, the only thing he ate were carobs. He didn't have anything else. He would go from Shabbos to Shabbos and just eat carobs. And so a voice from heaven, it's called a bat kol, a heavenly voice declared that the whole world is sustained for the sake of Hanina, my son. This is the voice that came from heaven. So what the Baal Shem Tov says, now again, this is the point I was trying to make. Everything is in the words itself. So it says, Kol olam nizun bishvil Hanina ben Dosa. Hanina beni, my son. Bishvil means for the sake of. So the simple understanding is the whole world is sustained for the sake of, because Hanina, my son, is so holy. And we might think, because he's so poverty-stricken, how how could he have any effect on the world being sustained? But God says his holiness is so great that despite the fact that he's only eating cherubs, his holiness is sustaining the whole world. So the Baal Shem looks at the word bishvil. If you look at the word shvil, shvil means a pathway, a way through the forest, through the mountains, a shvil. In modern Hebrew also, a shvil is a pathway. So the Baal Shem Tov says, read it like this, that the whole world is provided through the pathway that Hanina, my son, makes for the whole world. In other words, he's leading the whole world with his holiness. So the Baal Shem Tov sees it, we'll call it a play on words, but he sees through this simple understanding of bishvil, which means for the sake of, and he interprets it because of the pathway that Hanin is making through his holiness. So that's right at the beginning of the Keter Shem Tov. So I just want to say, if some of you have this book, apparently there are different editions, publications of the Keter Shem Tov, and apparently some of the numbering is different. So I'm going by the numbering of this. This is from Chabad. And so when I say what we just learned was the Torah Hey, the fifth Torah, right from the beginning. The next one is Vav, and this is a longer one. And it says like this. He's taking a verse from the Parsha of Yitro. And Moshe is saying, Hadavar asher yikshem mikem takrivun alai. Those things that are too difficult for you, this is part of Moshe setting up the whole judicial system. At first, he was going to be the sole judge of all of Israel. His father-in-law, Yitro, says, you won't be able to handle that, and the people won't be able to handle that. How can you have one judge for 3 million people? And Yitro suggested that he makes leaders of 1,000, leaders of 100, of 10, of 50, of 10. And then the idea is, but if whatever's too hard for all of the, let's call the lower courts, just like in the judicial system today, if lower courts cannot decide certain things, it gets bumped up until you get to the Supreme Court, or in Jewish tradition, the Sanhedrin. But Moshe, this is in the desert, Moshe says, those things that are too hard, mikem, from you, bring to me. So look what the Baal Shem Tov says here. He quotes the Ramban, who wrote a famous letter to his son before his son got married, with all kinds of advice for him. And so part of the advice was, Im yistapek lecha be'eze devar ech la'asoto k'sheyesh bo derachim letzaded lekan ulekan. If a person has a decision to make about something, should I do it? Should I not do it? And there's reasons to think that either way could be acceptable. Question is, what do you do? How do you know which way to go? Oh, sheyesh lecha safek im hu mitzvah o lo. Or there's some situation before you, and you don't know if it's really a mitzvah or not to do a certain action. You don't know. To do it or refrain from doing it. But devar sheyesh la'adam hana'a. Now, this is what the Baal Shem Tov is now saying. He's saying like this. Hadavar sheyesh la'adam hana'a mimenu yikaven limtsoa raya lahatir ha'asur. So he's saying the psychology of a human being is, if there's something that a person is going to get direct personal pleasure from, not I'm doing this because it gives pleasure to God, or I'm doing this because it gives pleasure to another person. This is a pure personal kind of pleasure that is being contemplated here. So he's saying that the human mind is tremendous at justifying about I'm sorry, this has been happening more and more often. The internet just goes out on me. I'm sorry about that. So the human mind, if there's pleasure involved, might find a way to justify even something that is not permissible and could be completely wrong. O tireh kodem kol l'salek me'esek devar zeh hana'at smacha o kevodecha. So the Baal Shem Tov says, again, we have a situation. Should I do this or shouldn't? Is it right or is it not right? Is it a mitzvah or not a mitzvah? I don't know. So the Baal Shem Tov says the first thing to do is to make sure that you're not doing it for purely pleasurable purposes, or you're doing it to get some kind of power or honor to yourself. So he says, if you can divorce yourself from those two possibilities, then you can actually more objectively review this situation. But as long as the natural tendency of a human being is to seek out pleasure, and the ego of a human being is hardwired to exert power. He said, so the first thing you do, if you don't know what to do, check out those two things. Are you doing it because it's just personal pleasure here, and you're doing it because it's going to bring you some kind of honor or glory or recognition? If you can divorce yourself from that and then look at the same situation again, it will help you decide which way to go. Az Hashem yiparach yodiacha ha'emet v'talech lebetach. If you can do that, God will show you the way. God will make it clear to you which way to go, and you can be assured that you're on the right path. That's what the Baal Shem Tov said. So now he connects this teaching to the verse that we brought in the beginning. V'davar asher yikshev mikem takrivun alai. And that which is too hard for you to judge, bring to me. So given what we just said about how the Baal Shem Tov's advice for how to make a decision between something you just don't know which way to go. So he says, that's what it means when it says, Davar asher yikshem mikem, she'ein chem yodim ech lasoto olimnoa. Because again, you don't know to do it or not to do it. Hasafek nolad mikem. The question, the doubt, is coming from you. Let's read the verse again. There's one way of reading it. If the Hadavar asher yikshem mikem, if there's something among you that you can't decide, bring it to me. But he reads it differently. He says, if there's something that is hard for you, it's coming from within you. That is this desire for pleasure and this desire for honor or power. That's why you can't decide, is because these two things are coloring, is making what could be an objective choice totally subjective, coming from you. Again, he's looking at the words itself and he's reinterpreting it on a much, much deeper psychological level. Sheyesh bo hane'etchem, because from you is coming this desire for pleasure. And that's why you in a certain way, you should be able to understand whether you should do this or not. But since this desire for pleasure is coloring the situation, that's why you have a doubt. Therefore, remove yourself, step outside and check yourself out if you're doing this for pleasure or honor. And then it says, "V'tikravuna lai," bring it to me. So the Baal Shem Tov is interpreting this, meaning more, bring it to God. Because if you do this, then God will show you the way that you should go. Because he doesn't say this. This is my own interpretation. A lie can be read, the name of God, Aleph Lamed, my God. Tikravu Elai could be read Eli, to my God. And then he says, then you will understand which way to go. So I want to tell a story. I believe I've told it. Some of you might remember it. But when I read this Torah, it reminded me of the following story. Is one time I asked Reb Shlomo the following question, that sometimes in life you set a goal and you go forward and try to accomplish it, and you're met with all kinds of obstacles. So I asked him, how do you know what the obstacles are telling you? Because in Hasidic thought, one way of looking at it is if you're doing something and you're met by obstacle after obstacle, it's very likely that God is sending you messages that maybe you shouldn't be doing this. Maybe it's a good thing, but right now it's not a good thing. Or maybe it's not for you right now. Maybe it's not a good thing. And so the obstacles are interpreted as signs to stop, refocus. Or, especially in Rabbi Nachman's teachings, if you're doing something good, better believe it that you're going to get obstacles, because that's the way of the world. Those are the dynamics of the world. You do good, there's going to be an opposite pushback. So therefore, if you're getting obstacles, that's a sign that what you're doing is good, and you should double your efforts to accomplish it. So I asked Reb Shlomo, excuse me, how do you know what the message is? Is it telling you to stop, or is it telling you to continue? So I remember Reb Shlomo, many times when he was contemplating something deeply, he would throw back his head, and quite literally his eyes would like go back into his head. And then you knew that he was like really contemplating this. And so he did this. And then he answered me and he said, this is the deepest question in the world. Now, if you know Reb Shlomo, he probably said that 100,000 times in his life, but you could tell when he really meant it. And he was correct. This is the deepest question in the world. A person wants to know what to do. And so this is what he said to me. He said, for this, you need prophecy. And for prophecy, you have to pray. That's all he said to me. And yet, I understood he wasn't trying to push me off. He wasn't trying to give me some kind of like general answer that could be interpreted in many ways. He was really telling me that you have to be able to go very, very, very deeply into whatever this matter is, and to have clarity. That's what he meant by prophecy. To have clarity, you have to pray for it. And I've always taken this as a directive in life. And this is what the Baal Shem Tov is saying. He's saying if you don't know to do it or not to do it, it's a mitzvah or not a mitzvah. So his advice is a little bit different, but the result is the same. He says, like, you have to step back and you have to remove your ego from this. And then he says, and God will then show you the way. And so since the Baal Shem Tov and Rabbi Nachman taught that everything is a sign of divine providence, so for sure you have to daven in a case like this. Okay, this is such a deep teaching for all of us. It's very, very practical and very relevant to how we make decisions. Okay, the next one is Zion, the seventh one. And here he says, he gives over an incredible principle here that weaves itself through all of the Baal Shem Tov's teachings. Again, he brings a verse from the book of Kings about Shlomo HaMelech, King Solomon, where it says at the end of his life, Nashav Hatu Levavo, his wives influenced his heart. Now, if you remember, according to the text, he had married 1,000 women, and most of these women came from nations all over the world. And we have discussed that at least his intent was very messianic. He wanted to bring everyone under the wings of the Shekhinah. And he thought he could accomplish this, or it could help him accomplish this, by marrying women from all over the world and bringing cultures and societies and nations closer to Yiddishkeit and Israel and Jerusalem. But it says at the end of his life, many of these women continued worshiping idols. And apparently, Shlomo either didn't pay attention, didn't give it enough thought, or the simple idea was that it influenced him. So this is what the Baal Shem Tov says. She'ein lecha shum teva b'Torah she'eino sovel bet mashmuot. So this is something that we have come across many, many times. We just did it in the first Torah we learned about bishvil. The Baal Shem Tov says there is no word in the Torah that doesn't carry two different meanings. And then he explained, well, what are these two meanings? Shehu bechinet dechar v'nukva. This is the aspect of male and female, masculine and feminine. Now here he's not talking about male and female bodies. He's talking about it in the way that the Zohar talks about it. that masculine and feminine are energies that pervade the entire universe and every aspect of reality. Masculine and feminine. And therefore, many times, psychologically, emotionally, intellectually, a man can be manifesting female characteristics, and a woman can be manifesting male characteristics. The classic example is a woman nursing her baby. So you would say this is the most feminine thing in the world, a mother nursing her baby. But in a deep sense, masculine means to give, and feminine means to receive. These are not moral statements or even quality statements. So a mother nursing her baby, in a sense, is the ultimate of giving. And in a certain way, from a Zoharic way of looking at the world, is the epitome of a masculine action. So this needs a lot of thought, a lot of discussion. But the Baal Shem Tov says every word in the Torah, you can understand it from different perspectives. And we've come across this numerous times where the same word quite literally has two different meanings, sometimes many more, especially once you get into permuting the letters of a word. So he continues, Al kain, ein lecha shum devar nivra ba'olam shelo yeh kalul me'akol. Then he goes even further. He says, therefore, there's nothing in the created world that doesn't include everything. So here he's going one step further. Not only does every word have both masculine and feminine energies, but in the language of the Zohar, in the language of the Kabbalah, since masculine and feminine encompass everything, so every word, in a sense, contains all of creation. And this is similar to a statement that all of time, that every moment of time contains in potential all of time. And we see in modern physics that isn't just a spiritual, mystical statement. That is actually a reality at the speed of light. That at the speed of light, past, present, and future are all simultaneous, and there is no passage of time. And every point of space contains all of space. Where do we see this? The idea of the Big Bang. That in one point of space, it contained 10 billion galaxies, each with 10 billion stars, all in that one point. So the Baal Shem is saying something similar here, is that in every word of the Torah, every letter of the Torah, in a certain way, you can access everything. Everything. It becomes we use the word shvil, it becomes a pathway to every energy. Then he says, "V'habechira netuna lo, lahatot le'eze bechina sheyirtzeh." Since every word in the Torah has both masculine and feminine, which we've now learned includes all possibility. This is very, very much into modern physics cosmology, the idea of parallel worlds, where every choice that could possibly be made exists in some, call it, world. So the Baal Shem Tov says that free choice is given to each person to lean towards or to follow or to be influenced to whatever aspect that they choose. Since every point of reality includes all of reality, and yet we have free choice. And so therefore we can choose what to be influenced by, what not to be influenced by. If we just look at the example in the Garden of Eden, the snake comes and tries to convince Chava to eat from the tree, but she didn't have to listen. He gave actually a very powerful reason why she should, but she still had the choice whether to listen or not, whether to act on it. And he says, and then he connects it to the very verse that he is learning from. He says, L'chach nashav hatu levavo. And therefore, Shlomo was influenced by his wives. He didn't have to be. He didn't have to be, but it was there. It was part of reality. And so since he could be influenced and he could not be influenced, he still had the choice. But what he's giving over here in just a few words is this expanded consciousness of the reality of the world. And like I brought a number of scientific examples, he was like way ahead, way ahead of what quantum physics is talking about. He intuited these realities through the very words of the Torah. L'chaim, everyone, l'chaim. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, shehakol niyeh b'dvaro. The next one is the ninth one. This one is so fundamental. It's very short, but it is completely fundamental to everything that the Baal Shem Tov taught. And we already touched upon this when we learned about prayer. He says like this, again, he's taking a verse. That's one of the first things I pointed out. Everything is based on the words and the verses of the Torah, or the words of the sages in the Talmud. So he says, Mishehu chacham lev yikach mitzvot. This is coming from Mishlei, the 10th chapter, the 8th verse. 10th chapter, 8th verse of Proverbs says, Mishehu chacham lev yikach mitzvot. The one who is wise of heart will take mitzvot. So his question here really is, why is the word mitzvot plural? You might think it would say, a person who is wise of heart will choose a mitzvah. Like we talked before, you have a situation, you don't know if it's a mitzvah or not a mitzvah. Should I do it or shouldn't I do it? Here, we can understand the simple thing. A wise person chooses to do mitzvot. Nonetheless, the Baal Shem Tov is commenting on the fact that mitzvot is plural. So he says like this, L'kasher ma'aseh mitzvah she'oseh shenikra mitzvah tata, that a person should connect the mitzvah that they are doing. And he says this is called the lower mitzvah, the physical act or the physical speech of a mitzvah is called the lower mitzvah. Liyachada el mitzvah el yonah. And a person should connect it to a higher mitzvah. So what he's explaining here, it says mitzvot plural, not because it means to say that a wise person will choose to do mitzvot in the plural. He's trying to say that every mitzvah has two aspects. A lower aspect, which is the fulfillment of the mitzvah in the simple physical manner, but that the person has to connect it to what he calls the higher mitzvah, which he now explains, shehu hamachshava v'hakavana shel mitzvah. This is the thought and the intent of the mitzvah. B'zehu shomrim al mitzvot. And this is what it means about the plural of mitzvot. And he says this is also what it means, asher kiddishanu b'mitzvotav. When we make a blessing, what's called a longer blessing, blessed are you, God, King of the universe, asher kiddishanu b'mitzvotav, who has made us holy through his mitzvot, in the plural. And so again, the simple understanding is that, okay, we're doing a blessing on a particular singular mitzvah. And yet it says he's made us holy through his mitzvot. So again, you can understand that very simply, literally, that every mitzvah that we do makes us holy, in the plural. But here he's explaining that it's in the plural because every mitzvah has two aspects. And to do a complete mitzvah, you have to connect the physical act and the fulfillment of the mitzvah with the thought process, the intent, the spiritual intent, the mystical intent, the intellectual, emotional, psychological intent, and then you have what's called a complete mitzvah. So this is such a part of everything that Hasidus teaches. Again, this is a very short little statement by the Baal Shem Tov. But we have to understand the Baal Shem Tov was so influential. When he said something like this, and his students integrated it and learned it, and then started teaching it over, because so many of the students of the Baal Shem Tov became rebbes, became rabbis in different towns, in different countries. And especially his student who took over for him, the Maggid of Mezrich. So most of his students became big rebbes. But they're all trying to give over the teachings of the Baal Shem Tov. So when the Baal Shem Tov gives over what here we might think this is a very simple, obvious kind of Torah. But when the Baal Shem Tov said it, it wasn't simple and it wasn't obvious. We might think of it as obvious now because we've heard it 100 times, 1,000 times. But where did it come from? So the Baal Shem Tov is saying, now the idea of having a kavanah in mitzvot, it did not come from the Baal Shem Tov. But if the Baal Shem Tov began to emphasize that every mitzvah that we do has to have kavanah, has to have these two aspects. And we could take the opposite track also, that there are many Jews who, for different reasons, do not keep all of the mitzvot. They pick and choose. And I'm not putting anyone down. They mean well. They do their best. And many people, this idea is I'm a good Jew in my heart. I have the right kavanah. I just don't do any of the mitzvot, but I have the right kavanah. So that doesn't work either. Just like doing mitzvah like mindlessly, like a robot, routine, also it's better than not doing it. That should be clear. It's better to do a mitzvah even if we don't have the highest, deepest, most spiritual kavanah. That has to be clear. But the Baal Shem is talking in the ideal sense, in the holistic sense. Every mitzvah has to have both aspects. Okay, so we have time for one more. Okay, this is a short one, but also a very, very innovative and very deep. We've talked about this verse many times. The second verse of the Torah. V'ha'aretz hayta tov v'vohu v'choshech al pnei ha'tahom v'ruach Elokim merachefet al pnei hamayim. The earth was chaotic and void, and darkness on the face of the deep or the abyss, and the Spirit of God moved or hovered above the waters. Let's see what the Baal Shem Tov says. First of all, we've discussed the Midrash. It says, what is the Spirit of God mean here? That the Spirit of God hovered over the waters. So the Midrash says this is the Spirit of the Mashiach. But there's many ways to understand the verse. That is one of the ways. The Baal Shem Tov says, Da'inu rucho shel adam. Here he says this is the spirit of a person, not necessarily the Mashiach. He's not contradicting. He's just saying it also is talking to every person, like every verse in the Torah. This is maybe one of the Baal Shem Tov's most important teachings, that every mitzvah in the Torah, every verse in the Torah relates personally to every single person in every generation. So he says the spirit here that is hovering over the waters is the spirit of a person. Meaning the neshama of a person. It is hovering over the waters. What waters are we talking about? Baal Shem Tov says, He HaTorah, this is talking about the Torah. Now, we've discussed numerous times the statement of the sages, Ein Mayim Ela Torah. There's no water other than Torah. So this is the first case, actually. This is the first time the word water is mentioned in the Torah. And here, the explanation of the Baal Shem Tov is it is hinting to Torah. How does he learn that? So he says it means that when a person, what does it mean hovering over the water? Here the Baal Shem Tov says when a person is involved in learning Torah. So what happens at that point? So what is the very next verse in the Torah? Vayomer Elokim Yehi Or Vayehi Or. And God said, let there be light, and there was light. That was the next verse. So the Baal Shem puts it together and says like this, Rotzeh Lamar, that is to say, Shegeir Hashem Einav Al Yedei Ora Torah. So in other words, he's saying like this, when a person is involved in Torah, when the neshama is connected to, hovering over the waters of the Torah, the result will be that God will create light for that person, and that person will now see the light that is invested in every letter and every word of the Torah. So it's actually, it's just putting together, it's called a juxtaposition between the second verse and the third verse. But it's such a creative or innovative understanding of the text here. And I want to add something to this. The Baal Shem Tov isn't saying this. This is actually my own thought that came to me recently. Was Ruach Elokim merachefet al pnei hamayim. And the Midrash says this is the spirit of Mashiach. So it says in the Zohar says on the merit of learning the teachings of the Zohar, God will bring the redemption with compassion. This is a statement in the Zohar. It's almost a prediction. If it was just a statement, it would be one thing. But it's quite literally a prediction that through the study of the mystical tradition of the Torah, the inner dimensions of the Torah, God will bring the redemption with Rachamim. And so therefore, the Baal Shem Tov, and we've mentioned this already, and we will get back to it at a later date, the entire Hasidic movement is very messianic in its very nature. In its very nature, the Baal Shem Tov, even going back to the Arizal in the 1500s says that history is starting to change, and the first light of redemption is starting to shine. About 150 years later, the Baal Shem Tov is now, in a certain way, like let's say the door was open a crack, he just put his foot on the door and slammed it open. In other words, the Arizal said it's time to start learning the secrets of the Torah more intensely. Now, the Zohar came out approximately 250 years before the Arizal. But the Arizal is like, we need to take these teachings because they're intrinsically connected to the redemption. That's the point here. And that's what the Zohar meant. Through the merit of learning the teachings in the Zohar, which will just expand, meaning the inner dimensions of the Torah, that will lead to redemption. And that's why in the Hasidic movement, and especially Chabad, there is such an emphasis in teaching the inner dimensions of the Torah, because it is considered that this is part and parcel of what will bring Mashiach. So this is somewhat really connected to what the Baal Shem Tov was saying. But this idea is what I'm saying. But it's really connected. That when the Baal Shem Tov is saying, when we're connected and involved in Torah, then God says, let there be light. And there is light. That is the light of the Torah. In other words, you can't access the light of the Torah without being involved in it. It means focusing. It means learning. It means studying in a very real, serious, tamima kind of a way, in a very sincere type of way. That opens the door to the light of the Torah. May we all be blessed to access this light, and that our learning should help bring Mashiach. Okay. Chaim l'chaim. Okay, let me unmute everyone. Okay, everyone should be unmuted. Oh, 1 second.